Real people, real stories, real success. Introducing Cynthia Archieri. She earned her master's degree in nursing from Riviera University, and now she's directing nursing operations at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Like Cynthia, thousands of Riviera graduates have their own unique success stories. With programs from the associate to the doctoral level, world-class faculty, and strong partners.
Hello, everyone. We're thrilled to see so many folks from across the country joining us for our conversation today. I'm Robert Crosby, and I lead our DC partnerships at Flambass Foundation. And we're excited to get started. We're going to start off with some housekeeping. And before we get started, we want to know that we want this to be an engaging experience for you all. And so there's 3 ways we want you to engage with us today. The first way is being active through sharing in our chat box. 2 of our Flamboyant staff members who've already introduced themselves, Justin Stevens and Camille Stewart, are here and excited to connect with you throughout the event. And they're going to also be dropping in links to the different work that we are doing, but we also encourage you to drop in links for other participants. And one note about the chat, we want to make sure you set your chat to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you're putting in the chat and can be a part of the conversation. We think it might default to all panelists, so make sure you go ahead and make that change if you engage with us in the chat. We also want you to ask your questions, and so please use the Q&A feature to submit questions to the panelists. We're going to be using those questions to be able to ask our panelists a little later on in the webinar. And the final way that we're hoping that you'll engage with us today is through answering some poll questions. Throughout the session, we're going to have a few different poll questions for you all to engage with, and we're going to be using Slido. So if you haven't used Slido before, you can join Slido and go to slido.com on your telephone, on your tablet, or on your computer. And once you get to slido.com, you enter in the event code LL2. So go ahead and get to Slido because we're actually going to start off with a prompt to see who's in the room. But we're going to give folks just another moment to get to slido.com. Again, you can use your tablet, you can use a cell phone, or your computer. Okay, so now that you're in there, you should see this question pop up asking you to let us know who is in the room, what's your role? All right, so we see some educators and former educators coming through so far, nonprofit leaders. All right, we're seeing some movement here. We have some advocates that are here, social psychologists, you see in the chat. All right, so a lot of educators and former educators, quite a few nonprofit leaders, district and CMO staff, that's awesome. We have some parents in the house, or caregivers. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna let that keep going, and we're gonna let that keep going, and we're gonna continue to see who's in the room and what the role is. And our panelists are able to see who's in the room. They were asking us, who are we talking to? So this gives us a really helpful understanding of who do we have, and as we think about the questions and the perspectives that we're going to be able to hear from, both as we engage in the chat, but also as we answer questions. And it definitely seems like that former educator, nonprofit leader, advocate, central staff are really rising to majority of who we have in the room. And so we also know that from our registration that we are planning to have at least 30 of our 52 states represented, and people from all kinds of organizations, school staff, district staff, and it's great to see such a diverse range of folks with us today. And we do hope that no matter what your role is, you really will leave this webinar with more knowledge and ideas in your tool belt as you do this really important work as we start school this year. So I'm going to turn to get started with our conversation today. And for those of you who are new to our work and new to the Flambass Foundation, we're an organization co-headquartered in DC and in Puerto Rico. And for more than a decade, we have worked to ensure all students have high quality educational experiences. And our work in DC is based on supporting practitioners, schools, and systems to provide family engagement experiences that are truly meaningful, that are context specific, and that accelerate student success and really ensure that all students have an opportunity to live a fulfilling life. So at Flamboyant, one of the things that we champion here in DC is real family engagement to ensure families have what they need to support that student success. And real family engagement happens where there are 4 things that are in place. And you see them here on the slide. Relationships. Relationships that are built on trust, ongoing communication, and shared power. Experiences where educators challenge their own biases and promote racial equity. Academic partnerships that include student performance, but also socio-emotional development. And then finally, that L, the leadership in schools, school systems, and communities who really create the conditions for meaningful engagement. And we know now more than ever, real family engagement is essential to support all of our students. A key pillar for what we see for how we accomplish and how we do real family engagement, and quite frankly, anything that we work on in this space, is listening to and learning from the communities in which we work. And the last few months have truly underscored for us just how important it is to not only listen and learn, but to keep those most impacted by inequity really at the center of our work, particularly our Black and Brown members of our community who for far too long have experienced systemic racism. And you'll hear us elevate this throughout today's conversation. We really don't see and think about family engagement without thinking about equity at our core. And so over the last several months and doing a lot of our listening and ongoing learning, what we've heard is that folks want more opportunities to access listening and the learning that others have done. And so that's why we're here. We're here to provide that space for listening, to share from those voices that really matter most in every school community, and that should be driving the way we think about how to lead. And that's students, the voices of our families, and the voices of our educators. And so before we transition for the panel, in part one, we really focus on hearing community reflections rooted in family voice and needs. For today, we're really going to be focusing on another critical and voice that knows our students and families well, educators. And so our guests today are based here in DC, and we are confident that their experiences and insights will be valuable no matter where you're joining us from. And I do want to remind you, you'll see on the screen before we introduce our panelists, which I'm really excited about, be sure to continue to engage with us via the chat box. Feel free to start to pose any questions in the Q&A box. And again, we will actually go into one more poll before we get started with our conversation today and with the panelists. So we know that it's been a last 6 months like no other. And so we just really want to know, give us a word or phrase that would describe the last 6 months for you personally. Where are we entering into this space? And what we'll see is that if you go back to your slido.com, you'll have this prompt that'll come up, and we'll get to see what are some of the words that are resonating and that are coming up for different folks. And it'll start to allow us to see some of the trends. Like reflective is starting to come through a lot from those 9 first participants. And we've definitely been quiet and been able to have that time for reflection that we don't always get to have. That's certainly been true for me personally. Uncertain, lots of uncertainty, and hectic. We're also seeing some other things: unrelenting, eye-opening, perseverance, stress, introspection, frustration, trying, overwhelmed, juggling. Yeah, I think all of us, the juggling is so real. Cloudy, reset for some. Okay, we're seeing some other trends come through. Silver linings, adapting, yes, eye-opening. Yeah, we've heard a lot about those silver linings of how to take this unfortunate circumstance and it's providing time for the reflection or for family. All right, we only got 43 folks in that participated. There's more to participate, but I will give you some more time to go in. We'll have some more prompts and Slido to be able to engage with you all, but we appreciate those of you who have engaged. And it's really just, good to understand where we're entering the space. And so many of these themes that we're hearing come through, from frustration to reflective, uncertainty, anxiety, it's so humanizing because there's a level in which we all have experienced some of these different things. And so thanks again for sharing where you're at and where you're entering into the space. And now that you had a chance to share how you're feeling, I do want to introduce our panelists and have them come on screen. We are thrilled to have 3 amazing educators with us today. We have Amy Shetsky, who is a 3rd grade teacher at Garrison Elementary School, a DC public school. We have Daniela Anello, who's the head of school at DC Bilingual Public Charter School. And we have Carrie Richardson, who's the principal at Brooklyn Middle School, another DC public school. Welcome, everyone. So, just like we asked all of our attendees to get a sense for how they're doing and where they're at, in true core value, form for us at Flamboyant, we have people as a core value. I just want to know how you guys are doing and really start the conversation there. And Amy, would love to start with you. How are you doing? How's the experience been for you since this spring as a teacher?
Hi, Robert. Hi, everyone. When I think about distance learning, it makes me think of the last day that we were all in class together. And one of my kids that morning, he came in and he said, this might be the last day we ever see each other again. So can we please do something fun? And at the time I, brushed it off and hugged him and said, we'll be back in 2 weeks, like it'll be okay. And, so realizing that, we're still here now and it's going into the fall is definitely unsettling. And, I just wish I had known then that it wouldn't have just been 2 weeks, but I'm happy to know that, our families and our kids will be safe, and hopefully, the fall will go as well as can be.
And how are you doing personally, Amy?
Personally, I'm good. I'm in the middle of moving, which is stressful, but
Wow.
hopefully we'll, be settled soon. And yeah, my husband and I, he's a teacher as well, and he got, so we were supposed to go on our honeymoon this summer because we thought, oh, of course we'll go on our honeymoon over the summer because we're both teachers and we'll have more time to relax then. And now here we are, but it's okay.
2 teachers, same household. I'm imagining you guys having your corner set up for like, this is my virtual, learning space. This is your space. A move. We're so glad that you're with us, and you're super optimistic for all that you have going on. Daniela, what about you? How are you doing?
Yeah, I feel like many of us, I'm having a hard time making sure that I'm doing all of the jobs that I have really well, or as well as I would like. I feel like I can't do all of the jobs that I have as well as I would like because I am focusing on so many things across the board all at once and all in the same space. So I have a bunch of competing priorities, and I feel like I'm medium. I'm very medium as a mom, as a wife, as a head of school, as a friend, as a daughter. Like I can't really grasp how to do all of wear all those hats really well. And I think that's pretty unsettling, right? To just feel, oh, I'm doing the best that I can and I can't do anything perfectly. And I think that's just what I have to sit with for the time being.
Daniela, thank you so much for that real response, right? And all the different hats. And, we're talking about having a conversation with educators, and we're not just educators. We're all these other things, and we have all these other identities, and how does that show up? Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And what about you, Carrie? How are you doing?
Well, I definitely would say I'm doing well. Trying to balance just personal wellness and making sure that we are ready to open our school for our school community. But it's definitely a wave of emotions. There are days when I'm ecstatic. I wake up, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to try this new approach with our students virtually. And then there are those days where I'm like just praying and wishing that we hurry up and find a vaccine, because I realize that the school year is just going to be different. And there's so many unknowns that we can't plan for. So just a wave of emotions. I know most educators, and Daniela and Amy would probably agree, we jump out of bed most days. As we want to see our students. We're looking forward to seeing our staff. And it is those days where you just kind of reckon with yourself like, man, let me log on to Zoom, let me log on to Teams and prepare for this meeting. So just a range of emotions. But overall, I would say doing well.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Again, another super candid response of the up and down of emotion, right? Depending on the day, depending on the week. I think all of you guys' response of how you're doing just really resonates with us as educators, how students are doing, how families are doing. And we really are all experiencing with the multiple hats, with different personal things, but then also the up and down of emotion that this time has brought. Thank you guys so much for sharing authentically. And so, Amy, I want to start by asking you a few more questions, specifically as an educator. Then I'm going to come back to you, Daniela and Carrie. So to start with you, Amy, one of the things that we learned through our teacher survey here at the Flambass Foundation that we administered this spring is that teachers started to shift their focus during distance learning. They were focusing more on the health and the well-being of their students and families. And I'm just curious, if that resonates with you? How did you think about engaging your families differently during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember on the first day of distance learning, I was feeling unsure about everything. It had been after a week of, seeing everyone post on Instagram, like, oh, try this, this is free, Brain Pop is free. Like, it was almost like an overwhelming amount of resources. And I didn't really know where to start. And my co-teacher and I talked about, first and foremost, getting the kids logged into Teams. And I spent hours creating, a document with directions and icons and translated it and sent it out in all the ways that I knew how, and was like, okay, now let me sit back and, I'll watch my kids log in, and no one did, which isn't shocking because, anytime we're asking kids to do something new and hard, it's going to be hard for them. And I realized quickly that I needed to rethink how I engaged with them and how to connect with my students and families in the ways that worked for them, which, really encouraged me to shift my focus from creating assignments to instead, checking on my families and students and their well-being. And our school created a TLC list to identify which students needed more support and more check-ins, and our specials teachers and specialists, got to jump on that right away. My co-teacher and I had weekly Zoom calls with our kids, mostly just so that they could connect with each other. They even at one point created an iMessage group thread with all the third graders and put us on it, which we felt honored to be a part of. But it really ended up being a great pulse check for us because, we could see which kids were typing more frequently and sending messages, which ones were up late at night, which ones we were seeing in messages, but then not on Zoom calls. And, that was a way for us to check in with our students in that way. And I think one of the most impactful things I did one day is I realized, aside from the Zoom calls and the emails, I needed to just check in with my families in a consistent way each week, in an informal way. So each Wednesday, I would, just send a text or a phone call, depending on the way the family wanted to be communicated with, and just said, how are you? How's everything going? Is there anything I can do to support you this week, other than what we're sending? And it really became one of the most authentic ways for me to continue to get to know my families, because it was not just about the assignments, and it was more just about how they were doing. And one family who I've known for 7 years, I've taught all of their children, was texting me one day, and he was telling me all about how they had these 8 turtles at home and 3 frogs, and he was sending me pictures of the kids with these animals, and I had no idea that they had these animals, and I've known them for so long. And it ended up being one of the most meaningful conversations that I ever had with this family, because we were just talking like friends. And I think that really helped when it came to okay, now, as we're starting to think about assignments and making sure our students are still learning, having that informal way to check in with them really helped me do that.
Oh my goodness, so many great things we're seeing in the chat, things that are resonating with folks. But that, a couple of things that are really sitting with me is the focusing on the health and the well-being of students and families doesn't mean that you're not doing something else, right? It's not an either or. It is recognizing and connecting at a human level, and how that really does allow for engagement all around. So many great connections. And so, I think that was the experience from the spring. And I know you've been doing family engagement work at Garrison for many years. And, one of the core things that you all think about and you think about as a teacher is listening to families. And so as you're thinking about the start of this school year, both about the experiences that you have, but also the listening you've been doing with families. I know DC Public Schools is going to be virtual at the start. How is that really shifting or making you think about your approach to building relationships this coming school year?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that distance learning felt so scary in the spring is because we didn't have the chance to listen to anyone about what would work best. We just had to do it because, teachers and everyone that works in a staff was, we're resilient, and we just said, we're going to figure it out. And that's what we did. But it didn't really give us the chance to listen to families and find out what they needed. And, at first, for that reason, my approach to distance learning felt kind of inconsistent, and it took me a while to really feel like I had a structure and knew what I was doing. And I think now in the fall, we have a unique opportunity to use this extra time and, knowledge from the spring to make sure that we're listening to our families and addressing what they need. So for starters, at our school, we're going to make sure that teachers across grade levels, like a 2nd and 3rd grade teacher, and then a 4th and 5th, are pairing up to facilitate welcome calls with our harder to reach families, or ones that we, had a harder time getting in touch with during distance learning. And that's obviously a huge ask for teachers. So that's why we're going to prioritize that level of engagement for some students. to make sure that we're engaging them from the start. Another thing we're doing is prior to PD week, which starts, in 2 weeks, we're sending out welcome letters. Now would be when we're going on home visits with our families, so the relationship would have already started. So it's, it's hard to think that we'll just all log into Zoom on the first day of school and, be ready to go. And it's going to take more work than that, at the front end. And I think welcome calls and welcome letters will help us do that. Another thing that we did is our principal and assistant principal sent out a virtual learning survey that, wasn't asking about technology and, the more logistical things, but was just asking families about what they think and how they think virtual learning should go, what kind of activities they need, what times work best for them, what their child care plans are, just so that we know that information and are listening to them, because that's who we should be, basing this off of, rather than trying to make something work that doesn't work for our families. Let's make it work for our families. And I think, I always think about like the roses and thorns of any situation in life. And I think a rose of distance learning is that, long gone are the days where we can say like, oh, that family didn't show up to APTT, like, oh, well, we tried. Because in distance learning, like we had to figure out ways to make it work virtually, and we had virtual APTT meetings, and it was one of the most amazing things that I had ever experienced, because I was thinking about all the times that I probably missed on engaging a family because I didn't, do it over the phone instead, and I wanted them to be in the building. And that's just not, capable. That's not, what some of our families are capable of, and we know that, and we need to listen to them and make it work for them. And that's why I think listening is so important right now, and going forward as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Again, so many things. For the group, APTT is Academic Parent-Teacher Teams. It's a strategy that Garrison does and that Flamboyant supports different schools to do across DC. It's like a parent-teacher conference, but a group meeting. We can certainly put more information about that in the chat. I think a couple of things I just want to elevate that you said there is really thinking about, right, like all the way up into the start of school, how we continue to listen, right? How do we what works for timing, what works for scheduling, all those things, but then also being really creative around being able to understand that if we don't do anything before the school year starts, right, how do we anticipate and expect, right, families to really show up and students to show up without having any type of welcoming call or connection made. And so now I want to end with one question with you. We know Garrison has a growing and changing school community. And that may be similar to what some school communities that participants on the call has, and particularly across lines of race and class at Garrison. How does your identity as a white woman shape the way you really think about showing up for your students and families, particularly in this moment in time and, in our nation's what's happening in the space?
Right. Yeah. Since I started at Garrison 7 years ago, the community has changed immensely. And I think back to my first year of teaching, and, everyone has that like first year, like I'm going to go into, school and I'm going to know exactly what to do right away. And I remember that one of my students called me stupid white teacher. And at the time I remember, being really upset about it. And looking back now, I've learned that at that time, I was fully unaware of my privilege as a white woman and how that played a major role in my relationships with students and families. And he was right at the time. I had some serious reflecting to do before I could truly show up and be an advocate for my students and their families. And that moment in my career was really when I learned about the impact of, relationship building and being an advocate for my families that are most impacted by equity. And that's why we need to put them first, because it's what they deserve. And I know that, from my own perspective. And this will be my 8th year at Garrison, and I'm always asked, why have you taught there your entire career? I, have taught there since the day I started teaching. And for me, it's always the families. And that is always my answer. And I built trust and relationships with so many families. And I think one of the most detrimental things that I could do to that trust is leave them. One of, a family that I'm extremely close with, their 4-year-old was just the flower girl in my wedding in the fall. And I've always said to them that I'm not leaving until I, teach this 4-year-old. I was like, I'm not going anywhere until she's in 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade with me. Because, that's how I show up for my families, is through the relationships that I've built with them. And for me, reflecting on my identity is an ongoing process, and still something that I know I can improve on. And I remember at the beginning of distance learning, you know, setting up office hours and thinking to myself like, oh, look at this, like I can work from home. I feel like, you know, a normal working person. I'm not, you know, at school till 6 p.m. And during those office hours, you know, no one called. And instead at like 4 p.m., 5 p.m., 6 p.m., I was getting calls and FaceTimes from my families. And I realized that just because those are the hours that worked for me doesn't mean that they're the hours that worked for most of my families. And I reflected on the fact that just because I don't have kids and I have the ability to work at hours that seemed convenient for me doesn't mean it's the case for a lot of my Black families or Latinx families who are essential workers and caring for other students and families at home. And I had to check my own assumptions about what may not be working and why, and put them first and make sure that I was advocating for them so that it worked for them. And, you know, I've learned that the best way I can be an advocate for them, especially through distance learning, is to continue to, you know, build trust and show empathy, and, you know, show up in that way for my families.
Amy, I mean, I think, you know, the chat, we're seeing so many great things that are resonating with folks, and just appreciate your candor and opening up, and the recognition, that ongoing journey, and that reflection space, and being able to spend that time and share with us is just so powerful. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm gonna now get ready to turn the conversation to Daniela, but we're gonna come back to Amy when we bring everyone back together. So Daniela, thanks so much for being here. I know as the head of school at DC Bilingual, a big part of your role is to listen to your families and to your educators. So, you know, let's dig into that. You know, similar to what we heard from Amy, I know your school was also focused on student and family wellness this spring. Can you tell us a little bit about how you and your staff engage families as you shifted to distance learning?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, I want to say Amy sounds like such an extraordinary teacher that I was like, oh, I hope every single one of our teachers feels that way too and talks like that about the relationships they have with their families and students. It's just so lovely to see. As our school shifted to not being able to be in person, serving all of our families and students, we quickly needed to mobilize around how to support our families in every way possible. So it's almost like the school shifted from focusing mainly on the daytime program, the academic program, the data, reading, math, science, bilingualism, and after school programming, to what is it that our families need, period. And it could be anything. Our teachers, very much like Amy, had to focus a lot on how to get virtual learning to work, how to do that in an engaging way, how to make sure their kids are showing up, how to make sure that they were really figuring out what the particular students needed. So in my position as a head of school, I wasn't doing virtual learning or virtual groups. So I had to think more systematically about the school and all the people that were not doing the virtual groups and how we could mobilize everybody else around family supports. So we created family calls very similar to what Amy said they did at her school, which is checking in on families. And to do that, we had about 62 staff who signed up to call 10 families every week. And sometimes we could easily draft scripts if there were questions that we needed answered from all of our families, such as a technology survey of, do you have a working Chromebook for each of your children? Do you have working Wi-Fi? If not, could we support you with that? So some of them were a little bit scripted, and some of them were not. Some of them were just, how are you? How's your family? And because the same caller was calling the same family every week, it allowed for building relationships, trust, consistency. You know, the first few times the caller might have called the family could have easily not recognized the phone number, not picked up. You know, the caller may have had to leave a message or send a text. But as weeks started to go by, they realized, wow, this is like a really friendly call from the school that we love and trust. And they built relationships with the caller. And so that's how we were able to really hear what families were going through and what they needed. So it was in those calls that families really opened up about who had tested positive for COVID, and maybe some families who, you know, had relatives who passed away. We found out who needed diapers for their babies. We found out who needed food, extra food supports. We also found out supports, mental health supports that were needed. And so once the callers were able to take the information they were receiving from the families, we had our own internal system in which we quickly matched them with the right supports and right services. So our social workers, then would call and offer the supports that were mental health related. We had an operations person who would quickly mail things we had like Amazon orders going with, diapers and formula and things like that. And so it was a whole team effort.
Yeah, you guys, you're speaking to the systems and the structures, right? To really operationalize consistency and how important that is. And, I did learn that, you guys reached 100% of your families this spring through that divide and that conquer strategy. Even I heard there was some, driving visits to go and see and make sure that families were okay. And I think that such an amazing reflection around what is the importance of that leadership and the systems to support that consistency. And so I want to turn a little bit to thinking about this upcoming school year opening. We've been thinking a lot about equity and, how does this moment not create greater inequities with our students, our families, and as you think about, engaging your families and your educators in this upcoming year, how are you going to use any lessons learned from your listening to ensure equity of voice and experience?
That's a phenomenal question. We're facing this all the time. We have such a diverse group of families that we're serving, and it's all over the map. Their level of necessity or need, or what they think is most important that they absolutely need support with, varies significantly. So to give you an example, we have families who may have had, a Chromebook borrowed from the school that broke and may not now have access to technology. So it is hard for them to check emails coming in, or their email that they were using, they may sometimes they're not that comfortable with the use of email for communication, some families, and so they may not be getting all the school all the school emails. So that's kind of one example of, communication difficulties that we may be having with a particular group of families. And then we have another side of families that are asking the school to help form pods for them to connect with other families from the school. So they're very different kinds of needs. Pods, for many of you who might be familiar with them, are ways in which families can help each other with various things, like maybe having the kids be grouped together and hire a babysitter to watch them as they're doing their virtual learning, and the parents can all be working, or take turns supporting each other with resources and such. So as a school, we have to think about who we are as a school, our mission, our priorities, and make a determination with where are we going to sit in support of families? What is the highest leverage support that we can provide families to give them what they need to have their child be successful in the coming year? So in this case, ensuring that communication is had would definitely take priorities over helping families connect with or have the school do the connecting of families to form groups such as pods. But we can, with the idea of communication and supporting with families connecting with one another, we can as a school, make sure to create Google groups that are up to date with family emails that families can access to communicate with one another. And our PTA, knowing that that's, one of the necessities that our parents are asking about, formed a Facebook group. And that can allow for an avenue in which families can talk to each other and interact. But as a school, we need to make a determination of where is the biggest priority area, and how do we ensure that we pay attention to that and not get distracted with a lot of other demands that may be asked of us at this time.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you bringing up so many, different strategies. One, recognizing that different families need different things, but also how do you think about the school as an entire community, right? And leveraging through pods or through Facebook groups, this community mentality. And that's something that we heard from teachers in our listening, is that they wanted their leaders to recognize and empathize with what families and students were going through, and how that then had to shift and make them be conscientious of their approach. And so, it sounds like as a head of school, you're doing that, and I'm sure your educators and your teachers truly appreciate that, that consideration. And, my last question for you is similar to what I asked Amy, about your identity as a Latina woman, and you serve a diverse student and staff population. How is your identity shaping the way you're showing up to the work?
Yeah, I think there's this level of threshold that I carry with me that is pretty wide in terms of when I freak out. And I think that, being a first generation immigrant, having had my parents work really hard their whole lives, not having a ton of stability my entire life, moving around a lot and changing from school to school, and having a lot of disruption really in my life throughout, made me feel resilient. And I feel like I bring this level of, I can do this, I can handle this, this is okay, we're gonna get through this. There's this level of like, there's no stopping me in this work of trying to do the best that I can for our families. Like, I've dealt with a lot of bad things in my life, and I can deal with this too, right? So there's this level of, there's this saying that my family uses, which is de batalla, which is of war or built for battle. There's not a direct translation, but that's the phrase that comes up a lot. Like, we're built for battle. We got this. We can do this. There's no stopping us. If that idea didn't work, woof, let's come up with a new one and try again. And then let's try again and again. And so there's this, that I think comes from how I was raised and my experiences that I had, as a young kid, being an immigrant, not speaking the language, and having to figure things out as I grew up. And it really comes in handy right now in a moment of a worldwide pandemic where no one knows what's going on and everyone is in a crisis. So that's what I bring.
So powerful. I mean, what great words. De batalla, did I pronounce that right?
De batalla.
De batalla. Built for battle. We're getting that in the chat. People are quoting it, and how powerful. And such a, recognition of we're all bringing our identity and the strength of our identity to the work, and to this moment in time. Thank you so much for sharing, Daniela. Again, we're going to have you back on in just a moment, but I do want to turn to Carrie. And again, folks, don't forget that you can put in questions in the Q&A for us to be able to open up. We'll probably get to a couple of questions. So if you have any questions for one of the panelists, please put it in there. And so I'm excited to welcome Carrie Richardson over to the screen. And he is the principal, as a reminder, of Brooklyn Middle School here in DC. And prior to becoming the principal of Brooklyn Middle School, you started the assistant principal at Kelly Miller, another school in DC. So you've been working in the family engagement space in the secondary world for a minute, right? And we know in the secondary space, when we think about family engagement, students have a greater role in establishing those trusting relationships between educators and families. And it's that three-way street. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, how you were able to shift and sustain engaging both your students, your families during distance learning.
That's a good question. I've had an opportunity to work in a couple of different wards in the city, Columbia Heights Education Campus as a teacher, which I love, instructional coach at heart, assistant principal, as you mentioned, at Kelly Miller and now at Brooklyn. So what I found is that, in a city like Washington, D.C., that's already so transient, where our students travel to get to school, a lot of them on public transportation, or they walk, they're not buses. We see that engagement is super important in a normal posture, let alone during a pandemic. And what we found is that you do have to have those multiple layers of communication. So every school has a communication plan, right? Where you have your robocalls and you send out the announcements, you put the little flyers in the students' book bags and you hope they make it home, but you mail them. So obviously some of those things we continue to do, but you have to do so much more during this pandemic. And I know schools would agree. One of the things that we found is that we have to engage with our families more frequently and earlier throughout the summer. So one of the things that we've been doing at Brookland is, as soon as school ended, we started partnering with some of our families that we saw their engagement sort of trickle off. And we're like, hey, what happened? Was it a technology barrier? What was it? Did you have the right access to the materials? We're also a meal site. So I got to plug that. Say, hey, when you come in and pick up your device or return your device, I also want you to stop by and see some of the resources that we offer. So we've been really trying to engage our families all throughout this summer. The other thing that's so important is tracking engagement. We know a lot of districts and a lot of schools are tracking engagement, but you can't stop there. You have to zero in on what the barrier is for these families. So like Daniela said, we have a SEL care team and we have a behavior team, and they all have a caseload of students, and they're charged with figuring out what the barrier is. We've even had some of our SEL team members do some home visiting using social distancing, where we're not gonna do it, we wait by the mailbox. Hey, we just wanna make sure you're okay. And we have summer bridge coming up. Do you have a device? Do you have everything that you need? So we've really been tracking families too, and really trying to engage with those families much earlier in the summer. I was saying to another colleague that we're in the midst of summer bridge. So our kids would normally be practicing opening their lockers and learning the routines and procedures. And we're practicing logging into systems and platforms, and we're doing it much earlier in the summer than ordinarily we would be doing. So I would just say just engaging earlier, having multiple layers of communication, and really tracking our families and trying to account for what the barriers are is what we've been trying to do.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I'm sure that resonates with a lot of educators and school leaders, and so powerful thinking about, we have a whole summer, right? Like, we've been preparing and thinking about how do we learn from what happened in the spring from students and families. And so, one of the things that we've heard, you mentioned that as an educator and as a school leader during this time, not being in the same physical space with your students, your families, and your staff, right? Like, that doesn't feel good for you, and I'm just curious as to, I actually see you're in your school building now, safely, but how will you maintain that and support your staff to maintain that important human connection in this largely virtual environment with students and families?
Yeah, so every morning during an in-person day, we start with a chant or a creed. So I've asked all of my teachers to create a motivational chant or creed, and we open every day with advisory. So it might be something like, the first thing we must do is show up. We must have a mindset of success, and we must work extremely hard to accomplish our goals. Let's go, Brooklyn, let's go. So we do that every day anyway, but we have daily virtual advisory, and I pop in and out of those advisory rooms each and every day. And I'm like, all right, scholars, let's do our chant. And they're like, oh, Mr. R, let's go. So I start the day with them every day in virtual advisory. The other thing that we're thinking to do is a virtual lunch club. So twice a week, I have this little link that I sent out in the spring. And I'm like, if you guys want to eat virtual lunch with Mr. Richardson or another teacher or another administrator, they can pop in. And it's almost like we're sitting down. They're eating their sandwich or whatever they have, and I'm eating my sandwich or whatever I have. And we're just kind of catching up. So I've been happy about the virtual lunch club. But the other thing that we're looking to do are the virtual after school clubs. So I just have a mentality that we can't stop all of the magical things that make school just because we're in a virtual stance. So my kids that like to play chess, we still have been meeting in a virtual space. My dancers, my singers, we have a glee club here. They've been meeting in a virtual space. And so I'm popping into those after school clubs because those are the things that bring kids joy, but they also bring the adults joy because we love seeing them participate. So I'm just looking forward to continuing some of those virtual clubs and activities. But advisory is my thing. With my coffee, it gets me going every day. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's awesome. And one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is that actually sometimes in the virtual space, right, not ideal, but you're getting to see a little bit more in, you know. So one time, you know, I'm strategically placed now, but in one of the meetings, the college was like, I see you have this on your shelf. Tell me more about that, you know. So there is this ability to still not only do those activities, but, you know, but also connect and make connections. Like Amy was saying, she didn't even know that this family had all these animals and turtles. And so I think that's powerful. And of course, you know, as a Black man and as a Black educator, you know, Black educator man to Black educator man, you know, where we're at in this, you know, national reckoning around systemic racism, and we know it's nothing new, you know, but I am super curious as to when you think about the intersection of educating lots of Black students and working with a lot of Black educators as well, how does that impact how you show up, and particularly thinking about this year after the summer that we've had?
Daniela, she's framed it so well. But my mentality, and it's a Nelson Mandela quote that is all around our building. I put it on all of my newsletters. I put it on all the things that I send out to parents. And that is, education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. And I say that to my students because even before COVID, we realized the importance of education and the doors and opportunities that it unlocks for our scholars. And so we have this theme in our school called no opting out. So even during the pandemic, we're not gonna opt out. We're gonna look at the numbers. We're gonna make sure all of our families are engaged. We're gonna show up to the virtual spaces with rigorous lessons and instruction. We're gonna continue to provide our teachers with high quality PD. We're gonna continue to do virtual home visits with our families. So we can't opt out. Education is too important of a tool. It's too powerful for us to be able to say, oh, well, we're in a virtual space, 50% of my students logged on, that's it. No, we have to figure out where the other 50% are. And we can't afford to just sit back on our heels and just hope that a vaccine comes and that we can magically appear in our buildings. I'm actually in my building right now because we've been planning for virtual PD. We invite our teachers back at Brooklyn 2 weeks before pre-service to engage in what's called Culture Week. We want them to have a trauma-informed lens, and we want them to be, you know, up on the forefront in terms of best practices, in terms of how to engage our students virtually. So the district will offer them pre-service, but we offer our own professional development to our teachers because we want them to know what has worked for us and what we want to continue to do to partner with our families. The biggest thing that we're looking to pivot towards are the virtual home visits. We have a lot of new staff members because we're growing as a school, and we've been working really hard. Right now, all of our new staff members, except for one, they've gone through Flambass training to learn how to do virtual home visits and to learn how to engage families in an impactful way. So we don't plan to stop. We're moving full steam ahead. Our students are also in virtual summer bridge, my 6th graders right now. So I've been visiting them in their classes. We have curriculum planning virtually at Brooklyn next week. So our teachers are learning best practices, play posit, Canvas resources. So we're just trying to stay ahead of the curve because when school starts in 2 weeks, I don't want that to be the first time that I've assembled my staff together or I've seen my students. I want us to hit the ground running, and I want 100% of my scholars engaged virtually. So no opting out.
Super powerful, super inspirational. And, you know, I can't thank you enough for sharing that perspective with all of us and that mentality and the quote and how important it is not to, when we think about the potential for greater inequity to occur, I think that mentality of leading is so important and so inspirational. So thank you so much. And I do want to invite everyone back on camera. You guys were like so engaging, such great conversations. I was, you know, struggling with time a little bit because it was such great conversations. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to name a couple of the different things that I'm seeing in the Q&A. It's not too many things. There are some personal things that you guys can probably answer with folks one off. But I'm going to just name a couple of things and then ask you for a closing question, okay? So I'm putting a lot of synthesis and then responding for you all, okay? But I know you guys can do it because you're awesome. So a couple of people are asking about, you know, the curiosity of navigating the concerns of online participation, requiring people to be on camera, off camera, just all that comes with the online participation. And then also folks are asking a little bit about that tracking of engagement. And so, you know, with that in mind, that's kind of some of the things that are on people's minds. And then there's some specific questions we'll have you guys go in and answer. But I do want to be able to have you guys both do, you know, a closing question of, given what people are asking about and given you're talking to a large group of educators, in 30 seconds or less, putting even more pressure on you, what's a final thought or a call to action that you want folks to walk away with from today? And you've already given so much, so this is just, you know, what's another one? I gotta give you who to start with, Amy. Sorry about that.
When I'm thinking about this school year, the biggest thing I'm thinking about is just how I'm going to make the beginning of the year still special for this group of kids. I feel like, you know, I've like, you know, seen this class grow up at Garrison, and I've, you know, so many of them, I've been so excited to teach them, and I don't want them to miss out of that, you know, experience of feeling like we're a class and, you know, having myself and my co-teacher as their teachers and classmates. So that's my biggest charge, is thinking about what we're going to do to make the beginning of the year still feel that like same